Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you to tonight's edition of Transylvania Lectures at MCC. My name is Borbala and I work at the International Relations Department at MCC. What is post-truth and how can professional communicators and people in general navigate in a world defined by post-truth? This and various other very exciting questions will be discussed tonight by our guest speaker, Dr. Graham Barnfield, who has worked as a PR consultant and an account director in the Arabian Gulf, and took part in the European Union's science communication and in Westminster election campaigns. He spent 15 years as senior lecturer in journalism at the University of East London. The moderator of the discussion will be Peter Polacek, CEO at Diversity Advertising, Head of Communications at Vibe Festival. Please allow me to welcome them to the stage.
Okay, thank you. Presentation. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll probably aim to talk for about 20 minutes or so and just set out some broad topics, and then I will be quizzed about them later on. And coming back to the theme about public relations in a so-called post-truth world, you know, where does that leave us? But I was going to take a bit of a detour around a little bit around the history of PR and also some of my own kind of career experiences. And sometimes I'll be doing a talk a bit like this with people who are thinking of a career in PR. Maybe I put them off or encourage them, not sure which. But also it can be quite a misunderstood occupation, and so there's a good case for trying to explain what it does. Not least because as far as many of the effective PR companies are concerned, their work is noticed, but they are not noticed. You know, the agency is in the background and the client receives all the publicity, and that's typically the goal that they often work towards, except for when it's a PR awards night or something, then the priorities change very rapidly. So just a couple of key sort of historical moments for public relations that set the scene. Its modern inventor is seen as Edward Bernays, who was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. And Bernays came up with the idea of finding ways to link people's ambitions to selling products when there wasn't necessarily a logical connection between the two things. And most notoriously came up with the idea of torches of freedom. And what this was, in the United States in the 1920s, there was a taboo around women smoking. At the time they didn't know that would have been good advice around health and things, but for the tobacco companies, it was pretty dreadful that half of their potential customers weren't buying cigarettes. And rather than try and make a controversial switch around advertising, Bernays proposed at a prearranged time that debutantes taking part in a New York City parade would light up at a prearranged moment, and photographers would be on hand to capture this. And in that moment, partly through a sort of a backdoor link up with women's suffrage, women's voting in the United States, they made a connection between tobacco smoking with cigarettes and freedom, or torches of freedom, occasionally Liberty torches as a nickname for the popular brands. And this was seen as a key moment in changing how professional communication worked. Rather than by advertising space where the client would be in control of the messaging, but not really having an idea about how the messaging would connect with the customers, and dumping the old idea of the press agent, in other words, a journalist who was paid by the clients to write and place their stories. Modern public relations, on the back of the so-called success of Torches of Freedom, was able to position itself as a kind of master of storytelling and making all kinds of gains by winning at the level of the imagination, and maybe out of that changing people's behaviour, first as consumers, but then also perhaps as voters or as citizens, or as people persuaded to support particular programs and policies. So the kind of techniques developed by Bernays over a century ago, are very much seen as being there at the birth of modern public relations. And you'll notice my heading is historical criticisms of PR, and it's precisely the things that work in PR that simultaneously attract the controversy. You know, if I was to say to you today, it's really important to come up with a way to get more women to smoke cigarettes and smoke tobacco, you'd probably see me as the villain of the piece. But that's obviously partly because PR companies have also been involved in changing the narrative on tobacco smoking, you know, and changing the way we think about that particular habit. So the criticism of PR, that it's not playing by the rules, that it's potentially deceptive, that it's out there to grab the imagination and misdirect it, very much that idea is present at the birth of the profession. You know, that especially, but not exclusively, scholars and academics will often point to these procedures as being somehow unfair, lacking in transparency, being manipulative. I mentioned the connection between Bernays and Freud, and one of the things that Bernays followed up on Liberty Torches with was marketing Freud's work in the United States as something that the well-informed and thoughtful citizen and household have to have some copies of Freud's books in the home to read them to make more sense of themselves. So the notion that, let's forget some of the debates around Freud and treat him as a man of science, but the notion that that approach is being co-opted to commercial gain is again there as part of the criticism of PR. You know, somehow it's not playing fair, it's being manipulative, it's distorting reality. And then by 1961, Daniel Bernstein is pushing the idea of the pseudo-event. And through talking about the pseudo-event, he writes about and looks at all these occasions when things are happening and making the news, but they're not really newsworthy. So the earthquake and the car crash are genuine events in his telling of PR, whereas the thing based on a press conference, you know, typically in a hotel room set out about a bit like this one, but with journalists watching, the client usually hold forth on something, or these days do a PowerPoint and a video as well. Those things make the news, but in the critical telling around PR is that they're not real events. You know, the genuine stuff is happening elsewhere, and this either can't really compete, or worse still, is something of a distraction. So certainly with the United States as the home of public relations industry, many of the observers of this industry are kind of increasingly critical of it as well. The notion that something's not quite right is prominent in the scholarly accounts of what went on. Now, the tricky thing is, if I was here with my strictly recruiting sort of hat on and doing this as a careers talk about why you should be in PR, we do tend to swerve those scholarly criticisms, you know, and it's about how exciting it can be. I remember when the first time I got back from Dubai doing these talks, there's all 18-year-olds saying, is it true you get to crash four-wheel drive cars in the desert as part of the recreational fun we had out there? And of course the temptation in PR is always to say, yeah, come on, work with us. It's really great, it's just like that. But I think this is the sort of forum where, and I'll sort of project this, I think, this evening, is the idea that PR, a bit like journalism, are sort of cousins and enemies simultaneously. We find we've got this kind of two souls to it. So there's a side of public relations where the criticisms that I've just outlined apply, but equally there could be one that's trying to help and trying to make things better and trying to spell things out and get a more clear message across to people. A lot of the PR I started doing in Qatar, a bit later on from Dubai, we had to really hit the ground running with the pandemic and have communications around advice about workplace hygiene, about people switching their devices and software to allow them to work from home and so on. And clearly there are commercial benefits tied up with that for the client, because they're getting people to download the Zoom subscription or buy up the latest broadband routers for the house or what have you. But equally, it could be argued that this was a helpful part of trying to coordinate a response to what was an emergency at the time. So the idea, if I come across as this slightly contradictory character presenting public relations as having this sort of twin character, hopefully that's an accurate take on it. And that might be helpful for you to think through where you stand on it, whether you'd like to work in it or whether you would join the critics of Bernays and co. Just a very quick thing around post-truth and one of its cousins, the idea of fake news. Since 2016, the allegation of fake news has been thrown around time and again, and we'll go into this a bit more in the conversation. It actually is a term first used in America in the 1890s, and it applies to press agents and journalists planting stories that are hostile or dismissive of the public figures of the day. But the call fake news, the kind of slogan, resurfaces in widespread use in English language in 2016. And we might want to think about where public relations fits in with that. Just to whiz on a couple of other things that we'll be talking about tonight. Back in 2004, and we'll go into some more detail around this, there was a big crime wave pending, starting in the United Kingdom, radiating out into Western Europe. And the idea at the time, widely reported, is that happy slapping typically involved older teenagers assaulting people, filming it on their smartphones and uploading it to the internet to magnify the humiliation. And in the winter of 2004 through to 2005, this was seen as a really serious concern, both firstly around personal safety, then around policing, and then around legislation. You know, I found myself at one point having to talk to the Danish Parliament about whether laws were needed to deal with happy slapping as a problem. The problem was at the time, and this isn't true today, but the problem at the time is that the technology available to teenagers towards the end of 2004 really was not sufficient to sustain this so-called crime wave. One of the big telecom news stories, I'm sure passed you by if you were even born at the time in 2004, was that the UK launched the 3 network for mobile phones. Why was it called the 3 network? Well, it was the first 3G network in the UK. It had got hold of that part of the spectrum for mobile calling. And it wasn't a very big operator at the time, and the handsets tended to be more expensive because they were enabled for 3G video, and they would typically be on the price range of most unruly teenagers. And once the teenagers got hold of any video on these phones, if they had these phones, it was easier to share them via Bluetooth than to upload them to the internet, because the other thing that hadn't really happened to any great extent in the UK in 2004 was a rollout of home broadband. So weirdly, we had this big story about a crime wave taking place that wasn't really technically possible at that moment in time. It just wasn't feasible. And some people said, well, maybe they're stealing the phones, filming the video on the phones, and then sharing the video via broadband. But if that was, but via Bluetooth, broadband wasn't around, that was part of my argument. They're sharing these videos via Bluetooth, and that's proof of the epidemic. And of course, as soon as you phone up any telecommunications company, not just 3, they will tell you they've got no way of measuring the amount of traffic shared between handsets using Bluetooth as a mechanism. So it was, in a lot of ways, starting off as quite a conventional academic in a rather niche and nerdy sort of scholarly vein of things. In about 2002, we had the explosion of reality TV in Britain, drawing on Dutch broadcasters. We had the first English language series of Big Brother. And although viewers of modern-day reality TV won't believe this now, at the time, it was presented as a serious experiment in the social sciences. You know, how you can watch different people interact in a room over a 24-hour period, unheard of. Can't believe such things are possible. The insights into the human character that Channel 4 in the UK promised us through Big Brother on reality TV. Being slightly sceptical, I mean, obviously now no one talks about reality TV in those terms. It's all discussed as entertainment, who's going to win, who's the most hated housemate, or alternatively, there are shows where people have got something to do. You know, they're baking, they're fixing a car, they're doing up a house. You know, that's the nature of reality TV. But when Big Brother launched in 2002, it was pushed very strongly as a serious social science experiment. And me, I probably sound like a right grumpy contrarian already to you, but what I was just pointed out was that if you look at cinema verite in France or the direct cinema movement in the United States, they did the serious experiments of filming people for long periods of time in a very high shot ratios of wasted film to what went in the final documentary, and it was a very serious undertaking, and it was supposed to show human interaction. So anyway, I'd put out this essay that was aiming to debunk the claims of reality TV to basically do better what a previous generation of documentary filmmakers had done. And for that reason, I got invited to comment about happy slapping, because one of the other things people had started to find a bit unsavoury about reality TV some 20 years ago was the humiliation of some, if not all, of the contestants and the way that they had to undergo these various ordeals to stay on the show. And, I sort of very, perhaps too casually, drew a parallel between the humiliation of the happy slapping victim and the similar treatment of people on reality shows. But more importantly, I did point out that the happy slapping was not, it couldn't possibly be the crime wave which it was being portrayed as. It just technically was not possible in 2004 with the quality of broadband and mobile video and everything around at the time and the prohibitive cost. Ironically now, you can have lots of happy slapping and some of it find its way onto YouTube and so on without any major technical barriers that are taking place. But the sort of the panics and scares and things have moved on to other things. So I'm here saying, first of all, chill out about reality TV. It's not as great as you're saying. It's just dampening down everyone's expectations. And then I get a few slots on the radio and TV saying the same thing about happy slapping. It's not a crime wave, right? The technical possibility right now just isn't as big as you're saying it is. It doesn't logically make any sense. But obviously it was very sad that some teenagers were getting assaulted as a kind of form of entertainment. And that is a problem, though, those kind of petty motivations for assault. It doesn't mean to say you need new laws against it, because assault is already illegal. And there's various ways of punishing it in UK and then Danish law as the problem started to spread. So I became a bit of a talking head on this topic. But the really big story when a national broadcaster picked me up, and after about a 45-minute interview, it's probably a lot worse than what I'm saying now, but trying to think of some things to say, and they tried to get me to watch some of the videos. And again, there's the same problem. A lot of this footage was either unwatchable or it was staged, and it had been done on purpose to provide entertainment. And but don't forget, there wasn't YouTube proper in those days. There was a thing called Google Video, had yet to merge with YouTube, hadn't really taken shape. And even if you could hear about it, it was difficult to watch at home or on a phone because the 3G rollout was still in its infancy, and same with home broadband. So I made these kind of sober points about this crime wave, and as we'll see a bit later, I ended up being someone on television who appeared to have said the opposite, which was an interesting situation. Anyway, eventually one of the payoffs of all this was my university sent me out on loan to Dubai. There I am, looking exactly the same now as I did then, a bit more tanned in that picture. And I got sent out to Dubai to work at a public relations agency for various reasons, partly because of the conflict over happy slapping had meant I'd got a fairly niche knowledge around telecommunications, and some of the clients were working in that area or adjacent parts of IT. Secondly, the university at the time was very much tied in with the 2012 London Olympics. It hosted the American team at one campus, Singapore team at another, and inherited a few bits of infrastructure from the Olympic Park afterwards for teaching and other purposes. Less successfully, I would contend, Dubai at the time was developing a thing called Dubai Sports City, which was a heavily branded attempt to have a residential place, but with stadiums devoted to developing sport in the region. At the time, they were very keen to present Dubai as a potential Olympic host, which hasn't happened yet. But so in various ways, I'd mark my card as someone who could do well in PR in this area. And I think the third strand of it is quite a lot of experience in freelance journalism, magazine journalism, trade paperbacks, and so on. And this is, again, a point we'll spend more time on a bit later, but one of the oddities about modern journalism is its kind of love-hate with the public relations industry. Some of that's jealousy. You know, the journalists always know that they seem to earn more than us, and with less stress and less threat of, you know, mechanisation and this kind of thing. But often the truth of the relationship is that the journalist and the PR wants different things. The PR person wants to defend the interests of the client. That's what they're paid to do. And the journalist may need to expose the client. And a good critical journalist might want to write about the client or the client's industry in ways which are both truthful but also potentially harmful to the client. You know, that if some of this software and IT and things that I've repped as a PR isn't any good, or it has various problems with it, a good journalist should be on the case about that. You know, in the UK right now, we've recently been it's nowhere near finished yet, but there's been a scandal where faulty software in our post offices has resulted in post office managers being accused of theft. And some have served serious jail time, there have been suicides, bankruptcies, at least 900 post office managers involved nationwide, and faulty software at the heart of it. And the PR company for Fujitsu have had to spend a lot of time defending that software, or now saying things like, well, the management didn't really know about this at the time, and if you could give them a bit of space to help think about things, that would be really helpful. And trying to make a case for defending the manufacturers of the faulty software. On the other hand, Computer Weekly magazine, its journalists were on the case with this in 2010. So there's been 14 years of people having their lives trashed by the post office, but there were stories 14 years ago that could have put a stop to this, that identify these serious faults. So you can see why in that kind of professional setting and context, journalists and public relations people are often at odds with each other. You know, that we're trying to serve different interests and make different cases. And that's why, even though there are people like me, and there's quite a lot of people like me who've done a bit of both, and we've moved across and moved between the two professions, the idea that the professions shouldn't really overlap is a very strong one. So even if the personnel overlap, the idea of them having different interests, up to a point, journalists especially try to hold a line around that and try and defend their notion of the truth from what a PR agency might say. Of course, at the edges, things are a lot more blurry. You know, you will find that a very diligent journalist will occasionally phone up and say, oh, have you got a high-resolution head and shoulders photo of the CEO of the client you can send over because we want to use it in the magazine? You say, yeah, no problem. They don't say, on principle, I'm going to send a photographer over to take this identical photo because I couldn't possibly accept one from you. So lots of journalists use the PR industry to kind of grease the wheels of storytelling and make things work in a much smoother way. And in fact, as a lot of paid journalism jobs have shrunk, you tend to find people are more desk-based and they become more reliant on press releases, you know, more reliant on images and things that have been sent over by an agency. So there's actually quite a bit of compromise involved like that. And the other thing, PR people are forever treating journalists very well when they have to, you know, and I guess by the time someone's on their 19th fist-sized strawberry coated in white chocolate eating at some sort of reception after a press release, and they've got a £200 Mount Blanc pen and pencil set with the company initial engraved on it handed to them just before they depart, their attitude towards the client might become a bit more patient and more tolerant and more flexible even. So in theory, we have this big dividing line between the two professions, but in fact there is quite a bit of overlap. There is a Venn diagram, if you like, with a rather morally compromised bit in the middle. Where journalistic skills are encouraged, though, in PR, is being able to craft a good story and explain what's going on. We were talking beforehand about the way that in Dubai PR especially, every hotel in a press release is the most beautiful hotel in Dubai, if not in the world. And of course, anyone with a brain can realise that in fact they can't all be the most beautiful hotel simultaneously. There must be something going on. So what a good journalist can do is to take the story of the hotel and tell it in a different way. And they tell the story in a different way to make it newsworthy so that it gets picked up and that a media source, magazine, TV station, whatever, will run with it and tell the story again. Now, just to sort of finish off a little bit by talking a bit more about what happens in PR, and we'll open up. When you're working in public relations, there are slightly different ways in which you are held accountable, and this is by the client. I think if I just explain these as part of the kind of working day, and this is sort of going behind the curtain to see how PR works, it might help to explain to you some of what is going on in the background. So get rid of those. Right, now, typically with public relations, the agency and the client will draw up a plan between the two of them, agreeing what the scope of work is and what is going to happen with the client in terms of storytelling over a period of time. And I've sort of split this into, quote unquote, the narrative and the routine. The routine side is fairly easy to explain. So if the client is in telecommunications, you know there'll be a certain number of handsets coming out a year. And so there will be a Samsung story at one point. They might work with Xiaomi, and there'll be a Xiaomi story about handsets. And then the new iPhone will launch, and all telecommunications carriers typically want to sell lots of handsets, which will be chipped to only use their SIM cards. So you can see in a typical financial year or quarter or whatever, there's a series of routine events that you're expected to cover, publicise for a client. On the other hand, slightly more complicated, which is why I put it first, the idea of the narrative is thoughtful clients will have a sense of how they want the activities over a period of time to pan out and to tell a particular story. A case in point from Dubai was the client who was an antivirus software company. Who's had a problem with a computer virus recently on their computer? No, good. I mean, the truth of the matter is computer viruses are kind of on the way out. Right, and it's the person getting the memory stick from the Ark and plugging it in who might get one. But in general, the idea that someone would show what a good programmer they were by disabling big bits of the internet by launching a virus, that's long gone. Some of the people who made the software to deal with that realized that, and so they had to reposition themselves as computer or IT security companies. Because otherwise you get stuck with an obsolete product. So that would be an example of the narrative in PR. Rather than being the antivirus people, client X wanted to redefine themselves as the computer security people within the space of 8 or 9 months. And so the kind of stories and activities and so on that they were involved in fed into that whole pattern of working. So they would like to break a new story about a new type of online fraud when it first emerged and be seen as the first ones there. I mean, without stereotyping, I'm sure many of you have received an email from a deposed Nigerian monarch or general, and they've looked on Google, you're the only person they can trust with 28 million pounds of money or dollars from that country. Just send over your bank details and you'll get a share, hold it for them, release them. Yeah, anyway, we all know about that. And when those stories started to materialise, they tended to be done on what was called a kind of craft basis of an individual typing it up, typically an internet cafe, and then sending it off to a random collection of email addresses they picked up in various ways. 15 years ago, there was a big shift, and what was happening is spam farms, they were in the Ukraine, not stereotyping, not just saying that's where they were at the time. Spam farms in the Ukraine at the time were copy-pasting those so-called Nigerian emails and then sending them out, not individually, as before from internet cafes, but in bulk and so on. And so the client knew that was going on. It had mechanisms for tracking that down. It could locate things like IP addresses that had just been registered, which were the source of some of this hot spyware and spam and so on. And it was important to say that that's what they'd found and to announce it. And so what happens is over time, you build up a whole series of stories like that, and that navigates away from being the antivirus people and makes them look like the IT services people. It doesn't vouch for the quality of the products, and this has to be said, but that's an idea of steering their whole approach to a particular question. Another client did a lot of sports sponsorship, for different sports. Could be cycling, could be football, could be half marathons. But again and again, the theme gets repeated. What's the motive for this? Well, we want a healthier population. It's a benefit to people to take part in this. And over time, they get the opportunity to get the full benefits and live longer and healthy lifestyles. And sometimes think that there'll be additional things about sportsmanship and competitive, healthy values and so on. So rather than it seeming like a series of consecutive sports sponsorships, they get linked through the repetition of certain themes. Right. So the client is typically checking to make sure that you, as the PR company, are doing that in different ways, of spelling out the narrative and of embedding it in the story so that the client comes to be seen as standing for particular values, working in particular ways. Not a zillion light years from Bernays and his association of tobacco smoking and freedom, and the way he linked together those previously unrelated activities. In practice, then that means you break down the activities into a kind of diary, and you have a schedule of when you want to be doing different things, some of which will be determined by Samsung's release date for a new handset. Other things in the style of the pseudo event will just be timetabled for a Wednesday. And why is it Wednesday? Well, it's because, say, Gulf News has its technology pull out on a Thursday morning, and so you aim to get the story to hit that at the right time. There's no particular newsworthy pressure to do that at that exact moment in time, but it fits the routines of the agency. And same thing with why weekends are often a write-off for PR, because sections of the media you want the coverage in are not active there. So, the volume of work will typically depend on how much they're paying you, and there's always a lot of negotiation around this. How many press releases a week to send out. Sometimes the PR company has to advise and say, look, if we do too many, we end up competing with ourselves, i.e. the client, for space in the media, and that's counterproductive. Other times we say, well, look, we had a thing where President Bush, as it was at the time, Bush Jr., came to Dubai, and it made doing other types of stories very difficult while he was there. So the advice was to postpone until he'd gone, not least because the roads were closed, so it's very difficult to even get in someone's office to talk to them. So we said, okay, let's just take 2 days off, get the presidential visit out of the way, and we'll start again. And generally the clients saw sense on that rather than try and compete with the big story. How does the client check that we're doing okay? Well, the currency in PR typically is the hit, and that's slang for a piece of coverage. That's industry jargon for what people weirdly still talk about cuttings, which obviously dates back to a more print and paper-based media. So people will say, "Oh, we'll send you the cuttings file over," and typically it's electronic now and not paper. But it's a similar spirit that you can measure the success of public relations by the amount of coverage, positive coverage ideally, that you're able to generate in different ways. And then finally, the valuation is an important element of how this works, because typically with a PR company, special projects aside, you're paid a monthly retainer. So if some of you were to set up a PR company tomorrow and you get your first client, you would typically arrange to be paid a monthly fixed sum, and they would expect certain things in return for that. Like maybe 4 press releases a month or whatever. It depends on the size of the retainer. by providing a valuation of the coverage you get, of the hits or the cuttings, you show the client what this would have cost them as advertising. Because obviously people who work for advertising agencies say, well, don't bother with PR, or we could do that for free. And you're buying this space on the airwaves or in print or what have you, and by and large the message will go there as you want it, and it can appear. We don't have to mess about buying meals for journalists and gifting them. We just buy the advertising space and get on with it and do it like that. One of the difficulties is that people, readers, viewers, whoever, tend to treat advertising differently to content. If you look at the way, there are some suggestions about Netflix at the moment and it having an advertising filled version and a cheaper, a more expensive premium version, which is ad-free. And you're fairly certain that those Netflix viewers with the cheaper version will also be trying to find ways to get through the ads or ignore them or put the kettle on, or there's the advertising. So although advertising is potentially effective, the people buying it are often very concerned about whether it's working or not, and whether people skip the advertising. It's more effective, for example, cheaper and surprisingly more effective to buy a half-page ad than a full-page ad in print media. Slightly different on fashion magazines with that, because obviously the way the photography leads. But one of the reasons it's cheaper is people will skip a full-page ad and then they'll read the content of the other half, the non-advertising half of the newspaper page, and then there's a fair chance they'll see the advertising as well, particularly if it's striking and particularly if it's clear and got a bold message. So there is a sense that advertising is hit and miss, and PR people cash in on this by saying, look, you've spent, say, $10,000 on us this month. That was our retainer. We've got coverage that if it was advertising would have cost you $40,000. Right? And they know that because they've got the advertising rates for all the publications that the PR-based story appears in. Yeah, so providing a valuation of all the hits is very important, because you can say, okay, you've spent a one-off retainer on us this month, and here we are showing you that you've got the equivalent of 10 times or 15 times that much value in advertising. I'll finish off because I'm going on a bit, I think. But just to sort of round off, the other part of the public relations kind of reputation is crisis management. And we typically argue with the client that we are trained in crisis management, that if something's going to happen which will dent or damage your reputation, we can advise and step in and make the situation less worse than it would be. And all the work you've done to build up your brand and reputation over the years, we can try and stop that from being trashed by a single error or problem along the way. Now, that all sounds well and good. If I was to then tell you, which is true, that people in PR typically do their crisis management training by having a meeting where hypothetically an airline has crashed, killing all the passengers, and then we sit down, talk about this pretend air crash, and come up with ways to make it less bad for the airline, possibly even at the expense of the deceased passengers and their family. You start thinking, well, what an evil, bunch of weirdos. What kind of people would do that? But it's, relatively well known in the public relations business. The meeting about the air crash and how to make it less bad for the airline is a routine part of training. Right? And we'll talk about the implications of that a bit later on, but I'll put it out there because that's kind of disturbing to a lot of people, and to people in the PR industry, it's necessary, because they're still booking the trainers to come in and take you through the air crash and what to say to the airline about it. So we've got an interesting sort of dilemma to finish on there. We've got this activity where, on the one hand, I'm talking about promoting positive narratives, but I don't mind saying to you that there's a portion of our training which sounds downright sinister. And all the people who were concerned about Bernays and so on 100 years ago, maybe they had a point. Anyway, that's one to discuss, but let's leave it there, and over to you, Peter. Thanks.
Yeah, we can continue. Hello, everyone. I'm Polacek Peter, and I work at a marketing agency. You can say that I'm on the advertiser side. And I'm going to be the one who will ask the first questions, and then at the end you can ask your questions too. But first of all, let me tell you a small personal story, which is actually quite recent because it happened last night. We went out to dinner, and we had a couple of glasses of wine, and Dr. Barnfield was going on and on about how important it is to know the both sides of this industry, like to know the journalism part, to know what is newsworthy, but to be on the other part, to be a PR specialist, and how important is that to know both sides, because if you know it, then you won't write articles entitled "The Best Hotel in Dubai," like you were saying about that, when there are 500 best hotels in Dubai. So you will end up like this if you don't know the connections between the two sides. So when he was going on and on about this, I was having a really big smile, like up to my head when we were talking, when he was talking about this. And maybe first impression, he thought, okay, a crazy guy who is like smiling. It wasn't even funny what he was saying, but yeah, I was smiling because at that moment I realized why I was asked by MCC to sit here and talk with him. Because actually I know both sides. I studied journalism. I worked just a bit, like one or 2 years in journalism, and then I got to the other part, okay, the advertisers part, the marketing agency. But today we are moving more to the content part, and we have a lot of connections. We send press releases, so we are working on this side too, and that's why I was actually smiling yesterday, because yes, I really know both sides of this industry, and I like to know it. Some of my colleagues are actually here, and I always tell them to try to make my content not advertising, because that's newsworthy. You can get some excitement out of that content. So yeah, that's how I'm into this part. But okay, let's get back to the topic, and let's actually invite our audience to our last night's dinner table to maybe discuss with us this topic. Maybe not where we talked about football, but why not? So yeah, my first impression about you was reading an article on The Guardian. You already mentioned some part of it on this presentation, but what was interesting for me, that Guardian titled this article, Dr. Graham Barnfield, is he an expert? He is now. This was the title of the article, and it really fascinated me that you actually became an expert on a topic which you didn't want to get to be an expert. Like, tell us this story, please, because I think everyone should know about it.
Yeah, this was mentioned briefly at the start, the rise of happy slapping as a so-called crime wave or a pseudo event. And as I said to you at the beginning, I think for people involved in it at the time, it was distressing to be slapped. However, the idea that this was all the internet content of the year 2004 and over the winter into 2005, it just didn't make sense. It didn't hold up. But that was something I worked out really once the whole thing had got moving, for those unexpected reasons that I described. That having, but basically, I'd commented on documentary. This comes from a journalism background, and typically teach the history of documentary module at a couple of universities and things like that. And when Big Brother specifically, which was a Dutch TV show, but came to Britain for its first year, all of the marketing around it was what a serious experiment in the social sciences this was, and how it would, lay bare human nature. And I say this to people nowadays, and because often, reality TV is not anything like that. No one bothers to talk about social science in it, anymore in connection with it. You think, well, what was going on then? The top UK reality show at the moment it involves putting celebrities in the Australian outback where they eat various insects and kangaroo offal and stuff, and the one who's still going at the end of the programme is declared the winner. So it's not exactly a social science experiment, but in those days those claims were being made. And in a rather first of all, I just wrote a chapter, as scholars do, that was saying actually if you compare these claims to those associated with direct cinema and cinema verite as documentary film movements, it's clear it's the older movements that were the more serious ones, and that the idea that this is social science is very much part of marketing these TV shows rather than what actually goes on. Out of that, then I got asked to comment on on happy slapping, and at the time it just seemed like there has been what some theorists talk about as a transformation of intimacy, that lots of things that might have been private in the past get shared in a big way, and that can include people's personal misery and upset and so on, particularly through not exclusively, but particularly on reality TV shows. So what was happening with happy slapping, a lot of which was school bullying, was kind of a piece with this. I made the observation, if you think about the career criminal, why would they manufacture evidence against themselves by filming it on a phone, and will carry around this video that could potentially convict them? But clearly people making these clips, typically unwatchable based on the technology available to them, were into something else. They were into the humiliation. So in passing, I'd said that this is kind of, obviously it's an unsavoury activity. It speaks to the way that intimacy and private life are being kind of chipped away at. It's a typical sort of sociological comment, really. And that kind of got me more and more drawn into being the happy slapping professor, commentator, and so on. And what I was realising was just how much you can lose control of the narrative in those sort of situations. So I'm literally saying, look, hello, the network is called 3. They've just launched 3G in the UK. It's just technically not possible or cheap enough for millions of teenagers to be uploading video to the internet in the year 2004. You had to wait at least 2 more years for that to happen, by which time they'd largely lost interest in happy slapping. Kids were typically carrying phones around, and the high-end ones might have had stills cameras on them, but not video. And video was just about creeping in because you could finally do something with it in that year. So the idea that this was an unstoppable sort of crime wave needing new legislation really didn't make sense. But part of the problem was I was finding early on I was getting added to the crime wave, not because I was happy slapping, but because it was like I was saying, look, hang on, this is a problem, but everyone calm down. And I was getting reported as saying, this is a problem, not the everyone calm down bit at the end. And it did tie up with various other sort of trends as well. There were concerns about, social class and antisocial behaviour and things in the UK were kind of, modulated through some of this discussion. Weirdly, the advertising agency, there was a popular soft drink called Tango, and it had, for reasons, you can perhaps work these out, reasons best known to the advertisers, it had marketed apple flavour as sexual, and orange flavour as violent, and blackcurrant flavour as preparing for a war between Britain and France. So the advertisers of Tango were slightly out of control, but the orange flavour, which showed someone being slapped while drinking the drink, also gave a sort of framework for people to try and make sense of this. And weirdly, when people were coming up with evidence of happy slapping, they were producing the orange Tango advert, which was someone being slapped, which obviously actors staging it. So there were things like that, very odd attempts to pull in all sorts of different unrelated things to create the impression of a crime wave that was going on. Interesting, just a quick point, I don't want to go on about this all night, but interestingly, a lot of journalists were also very sceptical about this. a technology publication called The Register, the summer before, had been fallen foul of a practical joke involving new trends involving Bluetooth on mobile phones, and they'd fallen foul of some pranksters and reported the story and got egg on their face. So for a lot of, especially technology journalists, by the time this reappeared, this surfaced about 3 or 4 months later, then what the previous sort of practical joke around mobile phones had meant that they were actually also very careful. So you could talk to a lot of journalists who are saying, yeah, it's a moral panic, isn't it? It's a scare story, or it doesn't make sense, or I don't want to get tricked, or this clip is staged, it's not real, or this is the Tango advert, it's not a real assault, blah, blah. But then at the sort of the top end, like 10 o'clock news, with a top national broadcaster, then the crime wave was going on, and you needed to seize their phones and find the video and introduce new laws and blah, blah, blah. So it was an odd experience, and whenever I put my head above the parapet and said, yeah, but actually that's not really happening right now on that scale, or you can't know what's on people's phones to exchange with Bluetooth because the phone companies can't tell you, because they've got no mechanism of measuring content. Best they can do is tell you the size of a file in megabytes when they've got the phone on site to repair. So how they're telling you there's all this stuff, you're making it up. And you can be saying that sort of thing till you're blue in the face, but then you're popping up on TV, being quoted as the expert, showing what an awful crime wave that this is. So maybe I blame Tango soft drinks for that.
Actually, that was for me very, very interesting. That you found yourself on television quoted in this topic, and you made just a small comment, and then you became the expert, and this is how we get to our topic, that is actually a bit of manipulation, or you can call it post-truth, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, in the English language, if you start a sentence with the phrase that research says, or experts say, you can get away with an awful lot, and that has been the case. And in working in science communication, we often found that it was important to try and, rein in some of they weren't clients, but they were member institutions that had a breakthrough typically on preclinical or clinical research, and published it. But the temptation was then to follow that up with a press release, and the claims being made for the press release for what the new technique or medicine or whatever could do were often a lot stronger and and riskier than you would imagine. I mean, there's a big issue within, specifically in preclinical research, around what they call the reproduction problem. And that's one way you do an experiment, and everything stacks up and the results are in and ready for write-up. But then you repeat the experiment in identical conditions and you don't get the same result, or you don't get any result. And so in a lot of ways, that's for a university or biomedical institute or pharmacy company, that's a bad place to be in, because you've spent all this money, it's hard to show the results for it, and then the temptation is to kind of claim the results for it anyway. And that's again, with PR, you might advise them not to do that, to calm it down, but there'll be someone else in the agency saying, no, actually, this is a breakthrough, that pneumonia is on the run finally thanks to this new technique, and let's tell the world about it. But often you find there's a big gap, and where in terms of the sort of, if you like, the fake expert, it can be the people who enjoy high media profile are not always the people with the expertise. I mean, I think I've covered my back because I pretty quickly had to, write the basic articles on happy slapping as a social phenomena in order to dig myself out of a hole, and the things I've written about it and have been peer reviewed and that will stand up. Occasionally, when I say on a radio station, it's terrible when this sort of thing happens, and they quote me saying it's terrible when this sort of thing happens, and I find myself unwittingly amplifying this whole sort of so-called crime wave. And I mean, the sad thing is there's lots more recorded violence on smartphones and things that is uploaded to the internet, but the moment of big sort of social concern about it has typically passed, and there's But if you look at TikTok or what have you, there's often the users that are inviting real voyeurism into their personal lives. You know, it's very different to what things were like in 2004 with this, but often the same sort of concern isn't there anymore. You know, so yeah, so I think the unwitting expert is where I started off. By the end of it, I was kind of getting the hang of things and spoken to, you know, broadband installation companies more than I ever want to ever again, in order to sort of try and work out what was going on.
I think at every moment when we take a break, everyone has to ask the question which is here. So do you want to still work in PR? Like, yeah. Just to continue with the title of our lecture, Professional Communications in a Post-Truth World. When I first read this title, there was one thing that got into my mind. That why do you call our word post-truth? Why is this? Why our word developed into this kind of post-truth? I have some things in mind that yes, post-truth refers to things that maybe we have different media, and some people are reading one kind of media and the other people the other kind of media. And where is the truth? Is there something in the middle? But is it our word now, post-truth? Can you say that?
Well, I used it as a provocative description, to be fair. I think there are sort of, you know, long-term and short-term explanations of how some of this works. Certainly, if you tracked the sort of scholarship from the late 70s onwards, the idea that there's no such thing as truth anymore and other things have taken its place was starting to gain hold. You know, I mean, famously, Jean-François Lyotard's book, The Postmodern Condition, which started off as a report into the future of higher education in Quebec, and he wrote it, gave it back to the university sector there, and it basically says abolish the university sector because there's no such thing as truth, and they didn't want that. That's not what they commissioned him to write. Nevertheless, it's published, and the argument went, and I'm not saying this is my argument, this is like me describing the long-term argument, that things like truth, beauty, history, and progress won't break down into binary code. So they don't, unlike numbers or cells or something like that, you can't break them down into a string of zeros and ones and express them digitally, load them into a computer. Therefore, these grand narratives or meta-narratives no longer apply and are out of date, you know, and retrospectively shouldn't have applied to begin with, but IT especially has made that clear. That was Lyotard's argument, not mine, I hasten to add. So in the academy, there's pressure starting to build from the late 70s against the idea of truth. You know, that's one sort of strand of what's going on. The thing that's kind of polarized it in the more recent period, going back to 2016, has partly been the way the old 19th century idea of fake news, again drawn from the United States, has been brandished around in politics. And the difficulty has been that it brings two things together under the same umbrella. So on the one hand, there is making stuff up, you know, that's a dictionary definition of fake news. But equally, we've seen the same idea and term used to dismiss disagreement, you know, and you can see this, perhaps I don't want to zoom in on the Trump administration as was, in fact, as ex-president and possible candidate, you see Trump doing it now, that critical journalism becomes fake news. So the idea it can be a shield to beat away things that you disagree with. In parallel, the eruption of untruths in public life is there. That's not necessarily a new thing, but I think what Peter was alluding to about the way that the audience for this is often much more sort of tribal, broken down into sort of segments and niches, tends to give this a lot more purchase, you know. So early on, to give a practical example, early on working for by the way, you'll never hear me naming clients for obvious reasons. That's on purpose. But you can probably work it out with Google and whatnot. But working for a telecommunications company in Qatar, 3 and a bit years, 4 years ago now, the onset of the pandemic also coincided with the rumour that 5G, so skip 4G, you know what that caused, to get to 5G, the rumour that 5G was the source of the coronavirus pandemic was doing the rounds, right? And it's quite easy to say, well, that's obviously nonsensical, it's not true, or alternatively, you could pursue a more kind of scientific line through it, where you show from your knowledge of the telecommunications system how this can't really be the case. But a kind of a post-truth element of this is the way that if there is an audience that's solely online and solely in the 4chan or 8chan groups that are discussing the role of 5G broadband communication and 5G mobile networks in spreading disease, then it becomes a very sort of closed world. And the notion that there's some kind of competition of ideas and that there are opportunities to challenge this stuff, or even maybe, God forbid, these people are right and they get the chance to make their case, they're not going to do that if they're in their bubble. So I think one of the things that's magnified the idea of living in a post-truth world is the breakdown of audiences for truth, for journalism, for media, for discussion, into increasingly narrow channels, you see it to some extent in the United States with Fox News as a case in point, and then people who find Fox News a bit moderate and find an alternative on the internet. So that notion of a public sphere where we're in some sort of dialogue with each other has seriously fragmented, and that can mean that untruths are less likely to be challenged, and are more compartmentalised and pushed away from being exposed to the sort of sunlight of saying, well, what is actually going on here? Just a final thing that also means we've got to be careful about all this is sometimes we risk, or there is a risk of confusing the sort of media tribe with the actual people involved, because one of the shocking things about 2016, and I sort of say this in my democratic hat on, is it wasn't just people making things up and asserting things in this kind of sort of tribal way, but the different audiences for these ideas stopped being treated as our fellow citizens, and often they were seen as these kind of the deplorables. In Hillary Clinton's case, as she called Trump's voters. So it's important, while we can note the way there are these echo chambers that are developed, partly facilitated by the internet, it's very important not to end up writing off the people who end up in them, because it's worth, in fact, perhaps trying to persuade them that they might be wrong. Because, and certainly back home, we witnessed this around the Brexit campaign. There wasn't people simply had a disagreement about the future place of the UK, but you had people on both sides who treated the other tribe as evil, and their decision making was irredeemably bad, and that's probably why you shouldn't talk to them at all. And that element, I think, of the so-called post-truth world is the most damaging one. This is quite understandable that things are fragmented, but the idea that we can't somehow get back from that and persuade people, talk through the differences, I think that becomes a real problem.
But why do you think this changed throughout the years? Because I don't think that in 2005, when it was your story with the Guardian, I don't think people were talking about post-truth world. Okay, I was 12 at that time, so I don't really know. But I think that people weren't talking about it. So I don't know. Maybe social media changed it, because social media has, of course, the bad part of it that gives you only what you like. Like you see your social media on social media only what you like. But did social media change the word that much that now we are talking about post-truth?
I think it's a tricky one, because in the university in general, the post-truth thing was already pretty well on the march, and the idea of the postmodern condition did explicitly reject the notion of truth. But that tended to be very much in its own bunker as well. And often, my experience of students from that period was not like 79 in Quebec, I'm not that old, but towards the end of the 20th century, students were often quite happy to phone it in about how, we live in a postmodern world because I want the marks, and I want to get off the course and get an office job with my degree, and so there's always been some of that going on in sort of higher education, but by itself it wouldn't necessarily get the kind of purchase on the imagination that it's got right now. Kind of notoriously in the Brexit campaign, one of the memorable sort of slogans to come out of it in the UK was the idea that people have had enough of experts. Michael Gove, who was a prominent cabinet minister at the time and has come back as one since, came up with the idea that people have had enough of experts. And the experts were saying you will tank the economy by leaving the European Union. And the notion of having had enough of experts was kind of partly Gove's way of saying, well, let's not listen to the voice of authority on this. There's their truth and there's our truth. Now, actually, you could be a hardcore Brexiteer and still be very critical of the way Gove presented that whole kind of issue. But part of the problem at the time, was people very much talking past each other. So the Remain side was saying, don't tank the economy. Incidentally, also having a few untruths of their own, like an epidemic of super gonorrhea that never materialised, but they promised that would be an immediate consequence of leaving the European Union. But the difficulty was, one side were typically talking about the economy, and another side were typically talking about sovereignty and the kind of institutions you wanted and lawmaking and stuff. So people were talking past each other. There would have perhaps been some scope to change tack and persuade, but the thing with the post-truth bubble is it's just like the whole thing often became about how one side was not patriotic and how the other side was stupid, and it's very difficult then to find any common ground when things polarised in that kind of fashion. So I think the post-truth description, it's not perfect, but it tries to make sense of the way there's these sort of divisions in society, and if we were always talking past each other, then typically the evidence and things don't sort of count. You mentioned briefly working for the European Commission around what often euphemistically is called preclinical research. Typically, preclinical research takes place with using animals, which in the UK typically means mice and zebrafish larvae. They're the two main animal groups people test medicine, surgery, all kinds of things on. And also veterinary medicine, which is important for animal health as well. The way that typically gets debated in public is there is a side that says, the scientists are bad people, they enjoy what they're doing. There's all talk about they just do head transplants involving chimpanzees for laughs. If you actually look at the legislation, the higher primates are not. You can do behavioural research. You can observe higher primates under UK law. That's it. You don't get to do any research on them other than that. And yet, on the animal rights side, it's all about the terrible things inflicted on chimpanzees in the present day. How they're forced to smoke tobacco, like women in the 1920s, and all this unnecessary cosmetic surgery. And a lot of the argument is just untrue. It's plainly untrue what they're saying. And one of the reasons we were commissioned to do this research for the European Commission is that the European Commission encourages openness with the organisations, because typically what happens is you've got these kind of wild allegations flying about, and then you've got research hospitals, veterinary institutes, pharmaceutical companies who really don't like to talk about it at all, and they will even if they're just watching mice choose different types of nuts to eat or something like that. It's preclinical research. We don't want to go there. We'd rather not tell you about the numbers, the benefits, the downsides. They're very defensive about basic research, in other words, finding out how things work, even if there's not an immediate medical benefit in to be found. And so it's a very much an uneven sort of discussion, lots of emotion and false allegations flying around in public. Actually, in fairness to the anti-animal research side, there are lots of thoughtful, considered, low-key criticisms and observations being made as well, but it tends to get drowned out by all the sort of threats and allegations. And then on the other hand, people who look after the laboratory animals better than pets, better than farm animals. They have to be well treated. They're very expensive because they're specific, germ lines are bred for a particular purpose, and yet they really don't want to talk about it. Even though occasionally when they think like they're winning, there'll be a press release how someone's spinal injury has been repaired, they can walk again, and they sort of thank rats and whatever for playing a role in that research. So even the experience of working in and around science communication and the hard sciences, it was pretty tough going to have to deal with this kind of tribalism and people talking past each other and misrepresentation. It was a bit one-sided because obviously the science community are not necessarily going to go around making stuff up all the time about their opponents. But nevertheless, if we can't have a dialogue about things, then it's very difficult to resolve them. And I've sort of used the idea of post-truth to say, well, unfortunately right now, we seem to have got set in our bunkers, our different garrisons, and we're not necessarily prepared to have a dialogue. I mean, I don't accept you from this tonight, obviously, because you're here to listen and talk and contribute. We probably don't all agree. But in general, we've got a kind of public sphere that's often characterised by people who prefer not to talk to each other and prefer to have their worldview reinforced. And the media industry is typically accommodating to that in different ways and writing for their tribe, if you like, rather than trying to carry off the more general public.
Yeah, we are almost at the end of our time before we can invite our audience to our dinner table. But before that, there is one topic I think very important which we have to discuss. I think we can agree that this post-truth and people talking past each other, I really like this how you put it. People are really talking past each other. We can agree that it is dangerous. But I think there is one aspect where is really dangerous, which is politics, because for example, in America, people who watch Fox News, they say CNN is garbage, and people who watch CNN, they say Fox News is lying. Or you can take Hungary's example, where you can draw a really clear line between left-sided media and right-sided media, or so-called left-sided and right-sided media. If you put them together, you can say one says yes and the other one says no. It's really clear. So yeah, I think how this evolved, this post-truth is becoming more and more dangerous. What's your opinion about this?
I think it's important to separate out two things. If people disagree about stuff, then it's fair enough to perhaps come down on one side or another. That there are certain differences and competing interests in society that are very difficult to resolve, even if just at the level of dialogue. So up at the salt mine today on a visit, and clearly there comes a point in its history where the idea is to kind of deindustrialise it, not employ hundreds of people, but to close it down, reinvent it as a tourist attraction later. Now, you imagine the people working there, they would find how their interests are in trying to perhaps continue and prolong their jobs, but for the salt mine owners, then they said the time's come to close it down. So there are certain, I don't want to say magically we can overcome all this through conversation, because people in society do have conflicting interests. I think where we can afford a tougher line is not so much the kind of Fox News versus CNN. I mean, it would be better if both of their audiences were happy to dip in and out of other news media. When a channel called GB News came to Britain 2 years ago, which is was seen as kind of Fox News for the UK, the people who didn't watch it kind of had, that was the first part of their argument. The second part is the audience were stupid. If you sit down with GB News for a day schedule, a lot of the morning show, and that is fairly traditional daytime studio broadcasting. The tougher sort of politics is between 7 and 9 at night. There's an American-style talk show host between 9 and 11, and then 11 till midnight there are comedians reviewing the newspapers, you know. And so what was present, and the other thing that the critics of GB News always say is basically, one, no one watches it. What a joke, you know, cheap production values. Two, it is paving the way for fascism in Britain today. You know, so it can't be doing both because if it hasn't got the audience. So I think I'm quite happy to tolerate people, you know, my generous spirit there. I don't mind really if people have got some fairly niche media taste and don't necessarily enjoy each other's stuff, and that with news that's slightly different to entertainment though, and it obviously does mean that the politics can become unnecessarily partisan or divided or misleading. I do think as critical people we do have to also take quite a hard line about when people are just literally making stuff up. You know, if you look at the QAnon movement process in the United States, it's pretend, you know, it's nonsensical, right? And there are stories where good journalists can pick a hole in it to, you know, show actually this is pretty improbable, if not impossible, because the scenario you've set out looks nothing like something that could happen. I mean, that's going back to happy slapping with the 3G network installation and stuff, and moving forward to the 5G coronavirus fake link. We should be very tough on made-up stuff getting into the public domain and being used as leverage for arguing about politics. That's where truth is good and worth sticking up for. And journalists who fail to do that are not really doing their job properly.
Yeah, but when you are talking about canon, canon in mainstream media actually proves that it's something is not true, but the followers or the other side will say that media is lying.
Yeah.
So how can you what can you do in a situation like this? Like,
no, it's a difficult one because the typical kind of the way a conspiracy theorist ends up arguing back at you is by saying, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? You know, so the evidence that they've been misled or been making it up is typically then more evidence of the power of the conspiracy.
Yes.
And that's one of the things. It becomes like a misguided position of faith, that where people just carry on committing to, you know, it wasn't a meteor shower, it was aliens from Glaxos 9 landing overnight in the field, you know, and it's very, and the more you try and get sucked into disproving that, the more they tend to see you as a pawn of the invaders from Glaxos 10 who started the whole thing in the first, you know, and it's very difficult to win that around to a rational point of view. But it's worth bearing in mind that often we are dealing with ideas in front of an audience, you know, and so it can be that people listening to this who actually get the benefit. It doesn't mean you have to like debate lunatics day in, day out, which get kind of tedious, to put it mildly. But at the same time, if something can be shown to be false, you might not win round the purveyor of the falsehood, but perhaps you'll give some confidence to other people who might, you know, want to see things in a different way, or at least want things to calm down, you know, because I think if you're having an election, which could be a possibility in the United States, where those allegations about satanic cults and stuff start flying around again, which is part of the QAnon story, that's not a good position to be in, you know, because you have to, if you kind of set up a group of people as absolute evil in the course of political discussion, where do you go from there? You know, it's very difficult to then have a more equitable. If you were going to say you're wrong, here's some evidence that you're wrong. Have you thought about things this way? Then you might have a different different cases on your hands.
Right. Do you have some questions, somebody? I still have one, but if I hope that maybe someone has another question. Yeah.
I want to ask a little bit mean question for you as a PR professional. Linked with this, you were talking about this post-truth thing and why we ended up in this post-truth world. Do PR professionals have any responsibility that we ended up here? As we go back to your torch, Freedom's Torch example, PR professionals always knew that a good narrative is preferred by the public against facts or against truth.
Yeah. No, I think that yes is the short answer. Public relations professionals, through the techniques that they use, have added to a lot of the problems we've been talking about tonight. There's no point sugarcoating it. I wouldn't say that happens every single time in every single bit of interaction between PR industry and wider society, but it's happened often enough to treat it as a problem and to be wary about going into that business, and for journalists to be cagey about PR people. I mean, I'll give you a couple of quick examples if there's time. A boring kind of routine one, working with the antivirus software company, a technology journalist who was new to that department was testing out the software by running it on a computer and chucking a 3.5-inch disk in those days full of viruses at it simultaneously, and of course the software looked terrible, but really what was happening is that they were testing it wrongly, and so the computer was slowing down, so it looked like the software was underperforming. Very dull. Sorry for sending you all to sleep with that. But the PR person standing behind from the antivirus software company can then say, actually, this is how we should really run the test to get better results, better article, fairer article. No, probably not very controversial thing. But going back to Torches of Freedom, even though at the time, I mean, in fairness, the causal link between smoking and lung cancer took about another 28 years for that to be established and demonstrated properly. But at the time, you could well argue that linking tobacco smoking and freedom is an illegitimate link to make. There is some evidence that runs the other way, in the sense that young smokers used to, I don't know if they still is, but that was a sign of their independence, lighting up from their adults. Obviously, the tobacco dependence and the health problems remained. So historically, there have been plenty of smokers whose habit has made sense to them in terms of their personal freedom. Now, is that something that goes back to Bernays? Or is it also things like the parental control slackening as they get out of the house? You see what I'm saying? So the exact thing that you described, I would say it potentially is a problem. And I think going back to the sort of the Bill Clinton and Tony Blair era and forward for quite a while, the figure of the spin doctor and the political party with a spin room became symbolic of trying to manipulate the political process, and again, see that as a problem. Now, where we have to be a little bit cautious with all that is that the political process also involves disagreement, and contrasting programs, different visions for society, and so if the narratives are coming out of there are different, you kind of expect that as well. So it's a careful one. I mean, I talked about the crisis management training exercise at the end, because in a lot of ways that's the thing that kind of puts people off PR, and you sound like a bunch of lunatics to the uninitiated when you say that this is the training meeting that we all go to. Obviously, that said, you can also try and steer things in a useful direction with a good narrative, and this is where post-truth and actual truth come in. So if you're trying to explain things in a way that relates to how society works, what the evidence is, by itself, that's not a bad thing. I think, and just also in response to your question, the other part of it is having the PR company behind the curtain is also potentially part of the problem. You know, so if the politician is out there saying, look, this is what I want to do, and this is why you should vote for me, that's very different to having a office full of PRs phoning journalists they know, say it'd be really good if you could cover this in a particular way. And by the way, are you free for dinner on Wednesday, and all of that kind of thing, because that arguably distorts the process of information and working out what's going on. So I think it's a fair criticism. I think not all PR people are guilty of what you're saying all of the time. However, we have to acknowledge the way that things can go off in unwanted directions because of their direct involvement. You know, and the notoriety of spin doctors in the recent past is a case in point in that. Sometimes that can be a symptom, you know, and there can be other things going on as well, unless I've got time to go into that. You know, generally speaking, confident political parties with a solid base of support were more relaxed about not needing spin and PR and so on, whereas sometimes the insubstantial ones who are losing voters or trying to get undecideds to back them, that's where they start calling on these sort of talents or dark arts or whatever to spread the narrative. But ultimately they can also get caught out. You know, some of the big collapses of various organisations and companies in the recent period haven't been salvageable despite having good PR companies. Often they've dragged the PR companies down with them. So reality does kick in at some point, and the truth, you know, might come through, and people might get held to account. And they're all risks that people working in PR face, particularly if they push their luck, you know, with how much they might misrepresent the client's activities to the wider world. So.
Someone else has another question? Yes, in the back there.
Hi. How can serious causes have a voice in all this madness? How can a university, an MCC, organizations like this, fundraisers, anything? How can PR be useful in these fields?
Good point. I think if you get help with crafting the narrative, and there are a lot of organisations do have people inside who can do this, despite what PR companies will tell you that they have to be hired in order to do this properly. But the techniques of public relations are often helpful to get your cause heard and you know, in the public eye. So, you know, for example, one of the issues a lot of charities and NGOs can get into bother with is when the accounts, someone looks at the accounts, it can look like there's too much going on administering and not enough on the actual cause, you know, and that the kidney patients are missing out, but the office rental is costing an awful lot at this charity. Now, the sensible PR company will say, okay, this is something that could potentially be an issue in the future. Let's be ready to get out there talking about it if we have to. You know, what's the narrative? There are charities that are getting into bother back home just because of the way London rents are increasing. So more of the funds that they raise end up going on their office, and yet the contract that they've got with their landlord locks them in there for a few years. And it doesn't take much for someone to say, oh, you're supposed to be looking after orphans, right, but you're spending all this on luxury offices in London. Now, good PR would be being prepared for that and saying, actually, the issue is the rent rises on the contract, and perhaps in order to offset this, we are planning to sublet a section of the office. I mean, office space, so totally kind of boring conversation, but left alone, it can fester and be reported in very negative ways. I mean, this going back to doing this stuff around basically animal research and the European Commission's oversight of it, a lot of research institutions got into bother because they were so defensive about it. And that goes right down to the terminology. So they would call it preclinical research, and they'd do it anyway as if it was on the quiet, and then they'd reach the end of a process and the results would be published in PLOS, or one of the big science kind of databases. Then the animal rights activists would jump on that publication and say, hey, you've been doing all this secret stuff involving mice, and you're so ashamed of it, you're calling it preclinical research. Now, the advice is much better to be open about it, say what they're doing, say what the numbers are, say what the potential benefits are, and just put it out there. You know, that was the kind of advice we give individual organisations involved in that. Partly because the European Commission at times also coming down quite hard on them. They have to be transparent. We need figures for animals used, we need these different species, and the part of the, a bit like I was saying before, part of the problem for a lot of these research institutions is that they were doing their own thing, so they're working on spinal injuries or fixing knee joints or skin cancer, whatever the cause is and the specific sort of problem. And these accusations are kind of piling in that you're just doing all this torture, basically, of not just mice, but chimpanzees. You know, there'll be these photos from the 1970s of laboratory animals from in Cambodia or whatever. Say, this is you. This is, and the problem was by being defensive and not getting out there talking, then they were getting into more and more difficulty because they have to unpick the trashing of the reputation, which is often then impacting on donations and fundings and so on. Whereas actually the research around this particular thing shows when most people said, okay, you know, some mice are used and we work on a cure for this specific illness, and this is the way we're at the moment. Or when people say, with basic research, we don't have a cure or a medicine at the end of it, but we need to find out how things work in order to use that knowledge later on. Actually, generally people are fairly accepting of it, you know, but the idea that you've got something to hide and you're not willing to talk about it, time and again ends up being completely self-destructive. I mean, we didn't mention this, the classic football example from back home was in the Hillsborough disaster. 97 Liverpool supporters killed in a crush, and the head of the Football Association at the time is there saying, I can't give a comment because it will prejudice a future inquiry. And incidentally, the inquiries are still going on as we speak. So immediately they appear wildly unsympathetic with something to hide. You know, whereas in fact, if the PR, Football Association and the lawyer sits down, they could get a much better story out there. You know, as it happens, the Football Association wasn't directly to blame for what we know from the subsequent inquiries, but it looked bad from the way it refused to talk about anything. You know, it wouldn't even send out condolences to the victims of the families of victims in the crush. So one PR lesson really is really, really important to get out there and get talking. But to do that well, you also need the preparation, so it doesn't just sort of fly off in unexpected directions. And you see this time and again when there's a high-profile sort of tragedy in the news. The organisation connected to it is typically very bad at making its case. I mean, all that training about what to do in an air crash. When there's an actual air crash, the airlines are awful explaining things, despite what, this is again comes back to your point, despite all these like tens of thousands of PR people being trained what to say to an airline in an air crash, they drop the ball so often. You know, there's so many. So even if there was a door fell off a flight about a month ago, and no one hurt, fortunately. Pretty scary stuff. And the response was to kind of retreat into a ball and building on what you were saying about social media. The reason that's even more dangerous now is the passengers had filmed the big hole in the side of the plane and put that on social media and on YouTube, so everyone knew anyway. And I haven't really talked about social media too much, but I think compared to 2004 and app slapping and all that sort of thing, now it's quite technically possible to be a one-person broadcasting operation, and if you have an audience of one, it doesn't matter that much here, right? Imagine doing a national newspaper with an audience of one. You're bankrupt within a week. You know, catastrophic. But with everyone potentially using their phone to make their own content and put it online and so on, there's a lot going on if you want to get a handle on the message. And there are shortcuts as well that people take which are very unwise, you know, like pretending to be TikTok influencers when they're not, and they clearly work for the PR company. But I think there's lots of opportunities with organisations of the sort you were talking about to use some of the opportunities for social media to try things out, you know, and to see. Obviously, I wouldn't advise that with the big crisis management type situations, but just, you know, show who's coming in to speak, what type of people work at the university, who's a beneficiary of the charity, or what have you, and the 2-minute video explaining that is good stuff. You know. And sometimes if you haven't done that, then someone doing the malicious version of it can get in front of you. That's very, very bad. You know, in the past, that wasn't as feasible or as likely because of the economics of the industry, but that's changed significantly now, and we have to be very wary of what it can do.
Maybe now you cannot hide the truth that easy, because maybe that's the good part of social media. People can put it up and they will see that door got out of the plane.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Somebody else has another question? 3, 2, 1, nobody? Okay. Then I will have one short question. You finished your presentation with this, so do you want to work in PR? And we talked a lot about, I think, negative aspects of this. But now we might be, both of us, responsible if someone will say yes to this question. What would you say to him or her if they say yes? What to carry on? What to be careful about?
Okay. With your kind of selfish hat on, a lot of the experiences of working in PR can be pretty good. You know, I mean, there's things you get to do and try out and be there at the ground floor of something happening. You know, so I've been, again, not mentioning too many clients along the way, but I've worked alongside Manchester United, for example, on different things. Or worked along on Formula One. And so if you're a bit of a sports fan, there's a lot to be done in PR, you know, the interface between the client and them sponsoring sport. And well, if you're not into sport, there might be, you know, or there are equivalent things that you can specialise in. You know, I've done PR for universities before, which is just very good, because one of the things you get to do is showcase the research going on there, and also find ways to kind of popularise it and share it with a wider audience. You know, because I know at the beginning I mentioned about Leotard and the postmodern condition, and a lot of that stuff was kind of unreadable. You know, there were far more students citing the book title and the lecturer's anecdote about it than ever reading it. But sometimes with PR, you can be talking to a university person, an MCC scholar or whoever, and sharing that knowledge with a wider audience. And you can connect that person up with a journalist so they get to tell their story and share that. So there's, and I'm not saying that doesn't mean there are not other routes now. People can go directly. You know, you can see the so-called influencer or YouTube channel or whatever across a whole range of things where people are making a name for themselves. PR is a great opportunity to do a lot of that. There is a positive case for working there. You know, it's not all evil conspiracy as perhaps I made it sound. You know, you can really get out there and put yourself on the line. If you have got journalistic inclinations as well, the storytelling can potentially be really good. The sort of stuff, as I say, the cliche is this is the most beautiful hotel in Dubai was always a kind of cliche. And it didn't take too much to actually rewrite that story to be much more interesting, and to be hitting on you know, perhaps the characters and personalities involved, the innovations, the technologies, the going for a particular look. I mean, there were days when we used to have what was called the elevator story, which was potentially pretty tedious to begin with, which was basically there's a new building and it's had the elevators reinstalled, and we're going to do a story on that, share it with the newspapers, see everyone's asleep straight away. But the challenge to actually make that interesting and make it, kind of grabbing for a journalist and working with them to get them to write something interesting for the readers is pretty challenging and rewarding. I remember one day, mahogany coat hooks on a golf course. I thought, oh no, why have I been allocated that to write? But by the end of it, and speaking to professional golfers and stuff, we got a pretty good sports story. And the thing was, the readers weren't looking at it like a catalogue with mahogany coat hooks for a golf course in. It was about, the sort of the development of the facility and the fittings and what different pro golfers had got out of this. And for that readership who are interested in sport and golf, we produced some really good stuff. So I think if you want to tell stories, PR is a really good place to work. If you want to sometimes get unusual experiences you wouldn't get in other industries, maybe you end up looking after one of your sporting heroes or something for a day as they talk to journalists about their career, and often they're doing it on the client's premises, so all the photos then reflect well on the client, and you go back to the client and say, look, this would have cost you 10 times as much to buy as advertising space, yet here it is as a readable story about your new facility, that sort of thing. So I would say if you want to tell stories well and have different and challenging experiences, PR is a great environment to work in. Journalism is too, with my journalism hat on. PR tends to be much better paid though, as well. So that's one other thing to think about. And at the moment, it's also less prone to bouts of mechanisation and AI and things shunting you out in the dark. So I think there's a lot to be. I've got a lot of respect for the sort of crusading journalist. I've been a journalist myself for 15 years. A lot of time for a lot of. Some of my best friends are journalists, as people might say. However, it's also beset by pretty bad job security in most of the lower rungs of the industry at the present time. So if you've got the kind of skill set and ambition that would work well in journalism, it wouldn't hurt you if it was to resurface in PR, solely in career development terms. As we hinted at before, PR's social role, there might be good reasons to be cautious about it, but as a career, it's usually pretty exciting. Occasionally that stops when the client is fed up and wants to shout at you about something, but broadly speaking, the challenges and the opportunities in the public relations industry are very good and worth embracing, and can lead you into other places as well.
Thank you very much. I think we are finished for today. Thank you for being here. So yeah, that's all.